Good evening, and welcome back to Footnotes Folly. I am Professor Reginald St. John Pemberton, and tonight we take up Book 3 of the Annals of Tacitus, the years 20 to 22. We give it to you complete, in plain modern English, from Thomas Gordon's grand old public domain translation. The plain rendering and the asides are my own. The shadow of Germanicus, dead in the last book, lies over all of this one. It opens with his widow Agrippina bringing his ashes home across the sea to Rome paralyzed with grief, one of the most affecting scenes Tacitus ever wrote. Then comes the reckoning, the trial of Piso, the governor accused of poisoning him, though watch closely, for the man really on trial, and never quite named, is the emperor himself. And when the trial is done, Tacitus does something wonderful. He stops the narrative altogether to give us a sweeping history of law itself, from the first kings to his own day, a meditation on how liberty and legislation rise and rot together. Let us begin.
During a pause in her stormy voyage, Agrippina put in at the island Corcyra, opposite the coasts of Calabria. She stayed there a few days to steady her spirit, still fierce in grief and unable to endure patiently. Meanwhile, news of her arrival spread. All the personal friends of her family, mostly soldiers, many who had served under Germanicus, and even many strangers from the neighboring towns, came crowding to Brundusium. Some came out of duty toward the emperor, more because others were going. Brundusium was the most convenient city on her route, and the safest place to land. As soon as the fleet appeared far out at sea, not only the harbor and nearby shores, but the walls, roofs, and every place as far as the eye could reach were filled with mourning crowds. People asked one another how they should receive her when she landed, whether in complete silence or with some sound of public acclaim. It was still unclear what they would do when the fleet slowly came in, not with the usual glad sailors and cheerful oars, but with everything marked by sadness. When Agrippina came down from the ship with her 2 infants beside her, carrying the mournful urn in her arms, and keeping her eyes fixed on the ground, one equal cry of grief rose from all who saw her. No one could tell relations from strangers, or the weeping of men from that of women, except that the newly arrived mourners, whose grief was still fresh, cried out more strongly than Agrippina's attendants, who were worn out by long lamentation. Tiberius had sent 2 praetorian cohorts, with orders that the magistrates of Calabria, Apulia, and Campania should perform the last honors due to the memory of his son. Therefore, the ashes were carried on the shoulders of tribunes and centurions. Before them went the standards, plain and without ornament, and the fasces turned downward. As they passed through the colonies, the common people wore black, and the knights wore purple. Each place, according to its wealth, burned costly clothing, perfumes, and everything else used in funeral rites. Even people whose cities lay far away came to attend. They sacrificed victims to the gods of the dead, raised altars, and with tears and shared lamentations showed their common sorrow. Drusus came as far as Terracina, with Claudius the brother of Germanicus, and those of his children who had been left at Rome. The consuls Marcus Valerius and Marcus Aurelius, who had just entered office, the Senate, and a great part of the people filled the road. It was a scattered procession, each person walking and weeping in his own way. In this mourning there was no flattery, for everyone knew how real was the joy, and how false the grief, of Tiberius over the death of Germanicus. Tiberius and Livia avoided appearing in public. They either thought public lamentation beneath their dignity, or feared that if every eye examined their faces, their deceitful hearts might be revealed. I do not find, either in the historians or in the city records, that Antonia, the mother of the dead man, took any part in the funeral. Yet besides Agrippina, Drusus, and Claudius, his other relations are also recorded there by name. Perhaps sickness prevented her, or perhaps her spirit, overcome by sorrow, could not bear the sight of so great a calamity. I would rather believe that she was kept away by Tiberius and Livia, who did not leave the palace. By pretending to share her affliction equally, they wanted it to appear that the grandmother and uncle were also detained by the example of the mother. On the day when his remains were placed in the tomb of Augustus, public grief showed itself in many forms, now in deep silence, now in a loud outcry of lamentation. The whole city was full of processions. The field of Mars blazed with torches. There the soldiers stood under arms, the magistrates without their insignia, and the people by tribes. All cried together that the commonwealth had fallen, and that from then on no hope remained. They spoke so openly and boldly that one would have thought they had forgotten who ruled them. But nothing wounded Tiberius more than the passionate affection of the people toward Agrippina. They called her the ornament of her country, the only blood of Augustus, and the single example of ancient virtue. They appealed to heaven and prayed that her children might continue, and that they might outlive those who persecuted them with malice. There were some who missed the splendor of a public funeral, and compared it with the greater honors and magnificence that Augustus had bestowed on the funeral of Drusus, the father of Germanicus. They said that Augustus himself, in the sharpness of winter, had traveled as far as Pavia, and from there had continued beside the corpse and entered the city with it. Around the dead man were placed the images of the Claudii and Julii. He was mourned in the forum. His praise was spoken from the rostras. Every kind of honor, whether invented by the ancestors or improved by later generations, was heaped upon him. But Germanicus, they said, had been denied the ordinary solemnities, even those due to every distinguished Roman. In a foreign country, because of the long journey, his body had indeed been burned without ceremony, but afterward it would only have been just to make up for the scantiness of the first rites by the solemnity of the last. His brother had met him only one day's journey away. His uncle had not even met him at the gate. Where were those generous customs of the ancients? The images of the dead carried on a bed, hymns composed in memory of their virtue, offerings of praise and tears. Where, at least, were the ceremonies and even the outward show of sorrow? Many illustrious Romans have died for the commonwealth, but none has been lamented so violently. This will be to my honor and to the honor of all men, if moderation is observed. The same things that suit private families and small states do not suit princes and an imperial people. Fresh grief indeed needs release and relief through lamentation, but now it is time to recover and strengthen your minds. So the deified Julius, after the loss of an only daughter, and so the deified Augustus, after the untimely death of his grandsons, both overcame their sorrow. There is no need for older examples. How often the Roman people have borne with constancy the slaughter of their armies, the death of their generals, and the complete destruction of their noblest families. Princes are mortal, the commonwealth is eternal. Therefore resume your several duties. Since the Megalesian games are near, you should even return to the usual festivities. When the vacation ended, public business was resumed. Drusus left for the army in Illyricum, and everyone's mind turned to seeing vengeance done upon Piso. People repeated their anger that, while he wandered through the delightful countries of Asia and Greece, he was using stubborn and deceitful delays to choke off the evidence of his crimes. For it was widely reported that Martina, the woman famous for poisonings, who, as I have related above, had been sent by Cneius Sentius toward Rome, had suddenly died at Brundusium. Poison was hidden in a knot of her hair, but on her body no signs of self-murder were found. Piso sent his son ahead to Rome with instructions for trying to soften the emperor, while he himself went on to Drusus. He hoped Drusus would be less severe about a brother's death than pleased by the removal of a rival. Tiberius, wanting to appear completely impartial, received the young man kindly and honored him with the gifts usually given to young noblemen. If human reports are true, I have the first claim to grief and revenge. But I hope they are false and imaginary, and that the death of Germanicus will bring ruin on no one. Drusus said this in public and avoided every private meeting. No one doubted that Tiberius had dictated the answer, since a youth otherwise easy and incautious was now practicing the wiles and cunning of old age. After Piso crossed the Sea of Dalmatia and left his ships at Ancona, he first took the road through Picenum, and then the Flaminian Way, following the legion that was going from Pannonia to Rome, and from there to serve as a garrison in Africa. This also became a subject of public criticism, because he pushed himself among the soldiers and courted them on the march and in their quarters. So, either to avoid suspicion, or because fear makes men's conduct unsteady, he embarked at Narni on the Nar and sailed from there into the Tiber. By landing at the burial place of the Caesars, he increased the people's anger. Moreover, he and Plancina came ashore in broad daylight in full view of the city, while crowds lined the river banks, and they advanced with cheerful faces, he with a long crowd of clients attending him, and she with a train of ladies. There were still other provocations to hatred. His house stood in a proud position overlooking the forum, decorated and lit up as if for a festival. A banquet and celebration were held there, and everything was as visible to the public as the place itself. The next day Fulcinius' trio accused Piso before the consuls, but Vitellius, Veranius, and others who had accompanied Germanicus opposed him. Trio has no part in this prosecution. We ourselves are not acting as accusers, but only collecting the evidence and as witnesses, presenting the last instructions of Germanicus. Trio dropped that accusation, but obtained permission to question Piso about his earlier life. The emperor was then asked to undertake the trial, a request the accused man did not oppose at all, because he feared the feelings of the people and the Senate. He knew, by contrast, that Tiberius was firm in despising popular rumors and was joined in guilt with his mother. Besides, truth and falsehood could most easily be distinguished by a single judge, while in assemblies hatred and envy often prevailed. Tiberius understood the weight of the trial and the reproaches directed against himself. Therefore, admitting only a few trusted persons, he heard the accusation, and also the defense, then left the whole case to the Senate. Meanwhile Drusus returned from Illyricum. Although the Senate had decreed him the triumph of ovation for the reduction of Merobodus and for his other achievements of the previous summer, he postponed the honor and entered the city privately. Piso asked for Titus Aruntius, Fulcinius, Asinius Gallus, Acerninus Marcellus, and Sextus Pompeius to be his advocates, but all of them made different excuses. In their place he had Marcus Lepidus, Lucius Piso, and Livnaeus Regulus. Now everyone waited intensely to see how loyal the friends of Germanicus would prove, how confident the criminal would be, and how Tiberius would behave, whether he would successfully hide his feelings or reveal them. He had never had a more anxious part to play, nor had the people ever indulged in such secret murmurs against their emperor or silently held harsher suspicions. Piso was my father's lieutenant and friend, and recently, by my appointment and at the direction of the Senate, he was made assistant to Germanicus in administering the affairs of the East. Whether he there provoked the young prince by obstinacy and opposition, and rejoiced over his death, or wickedly caused it, you must now judge with unprejudiced minds. For if the lieutenant of my son exceeded the limits of his commission, threw off obedience to his general, and even rejoiced at his death and at my affliction, I will hate the man, I will banish him from my house, and I will take domestic revenge for domestic injuries, not the revenge of an emperor. But as for you, if his guilt in the death of any man whatsoever is discovered, show your just vengeance, and by it satisfy yourselves, the children of Germanicus, and us his father and grandmother. Consider especially whether he corrupted discipline and promoted sedition in the army, whether he tried to win the soldiers' affections away and recover the province by arms, or whether these charges have been falsely spread and exaggerated by the accusers, whose excessive zeal rightly offends me. For what purpose was the corpse stripped and exposed to the eyes and inspection of the populace? Why was it proclaimed even among foreign nations that his death was caused by poison, if all this was still doubtful and remains to be tried? It is true that I mourn my son, and I shall always mourn him. But I do not prevent the accused from doing whatever he can to prove his innocence, even at the expense of Germanicus, if anything blameworthy was in him. From you I ask the same impartiality. Do not let the connection of my sorrow with this case lead you to take charges as proved merely because they are alleged. As for Piso, if the affection of kinsmen or the loyalty of friends has provided him with defenders, let them help him in his danger, show their greatest eloquence, and use their best diligence. I urge the accusers to the same effort and firmness. This much we will grant to the memory of Germanicus, that the inquiry into his death shall be held here rather than in the forum, in the Senate rather than before the ordinary tribunals. In all other respects, we will follow the usual methods. Let no one in this case consider Drusus's tears, let no one regard my sorrow, any more than the likely fictions of slander against us. 2 days were then assigned for presenting the charge, 6 for preparing the defense, and 3 for delivering it. Licinius began with stale and irrelevant matters about Piso's ambition and plunder during his administration of Spain. Even if proved, these things brought him under no penalty if he was acquitted of the present charge, and even if he had been cleared of former faults, he could not escape the burden of greater crimes. After him Servius, Veranius, and Vitellius all pressed the case with equal zeal, though Vitellius did so with great eloquence. They argued that Piso, out of hatred for Germanicus and a passion for revolution, had corrupted the common soldiers by tolerating general lawlessness and the oppression of the allies, until the most depraved men called him father of the legions. On the other hand, he had been savage toward the best men, above all toward the friends and companions of Germanicus. Finally, they said, he had destroyed Germanicus himself by witchcraft and poison. From this came the infernal charms and sacrifices practiced by him in Plancina. He had then attacked the Commonwealth with open arms, and before he could be brought to trial, they had been forced to fight and defeat him. In every charge except one, Piso's defense was weak. He could not deny that he had dangerously schemed to corrupt the soldiers, or that he had left the province in the hands of the most shameless and greedy men, or even that he had insulted Germanicus. He seemed only to clear himself of the charge of poison. In truth, the charge was not strongly supported by the accusers, since they could only claim that, at a dinner given by Germanicus, Piso sat above him and poisoned the food with his own hands. This seemed absurd. There were so many slaves present, besides Piso's own attendants, there was such a large company, and Germanicus himself was watching. It was hard to believe that Piso would try such a thing there. Piso asked that the waiters be tortured, and offered his own household slaves for torture as well. His judges were relentless, though for different reasons. Tiberius was fixed against him because of the war Piso had raised in the province, and the Senate could never be persuaded that Germanicus had not died through treachery. At an entertainment of Germanicus, Piso, while he sat above him, with his hands poisoned the meat. Some senators proposed that the letters written to Piso from Rome should be produced. Tiberius opposed the motion as strongly as Piso did. At the same time, cries were heard from outside. People declared that if Piso escaped the judgment of the Senate, they would kill him with their own hands. They had already dragged his statues to the place from which criminals were thrown down, and had broken them there. By order of Tiberius, however, the statues were rescued and restored. Piso was placed in a litter and carried home by a tribune of a praetorian cohort. People interpreted this escort in different ways. Some thought it was a guard for his safety, others that it was an officer sent to bring him to death. If he escaped the judgment of the Senate, they would with their own hands destroy him. Plancina was hated by the public just as much, but she had stronger secret protection. Because of this, people wondered how far Tiberius would dare to proceed against her. While her husband's hope still seemed possible, she declared that she would share whatever fortune came to him, and that if he fell, she would fall with him. But when she secured her own pardon through the secret efforts of Livia, she gradually began to separate herself from her husband, and to make her own defense. After this deadly warning, Piso doubted whether he should make any further effort. Yet, on the advice of his sons, he strengthened his courage and entered the Senate again. There he found the prosecution renewed, endured the open indignation of the fathers, and saw everything hostile and alarming. But nothing frightened him as much as the sight of Tiberius, without pity, without anger, hidden, dark, unmoved, and closed against every appeal to compassion. When Piso was brought home, he seemed to be preparing his defense for the next day. He wrote something, sealed it, and gave it to his freedman. Then he washed, anointed himself, and took the usual care of his appearance. Late in the night, after his wife had left the room, he ordered the door to be shut. At daybreak he was found with his throat cut, and his sword lying beside him. She would accompany his fortune, whatever it were, and if he fell, fall with him. I remember hearing from old men that Piso was often seen holding a bundle of writings. He did not reveal them, but his friends constantly said that they contained letters from Tiberius and cruel orders concerning Germanicus. They said Piso had resolved to lay these papers before the fathers, and accuse the emperor, but that he had been deceived by the false promises of Sejanus. They also said that Piso had not died by his own hand, but by the hand of a private executioner sent for that purpose. I do not dare affirm either story. Yet I ought not to suppress accounts given by men who were still living when I was young. Tiberius, pretending sadness, complained to the Senate that Piso, by that kind of death, had tried to burden him with public disgrace. He asked many questions about how Piso had spent his last day and his last night. The freedman answered most questions carefully, and some confusedly. The emperor then read the letter sent to him by Piso. It was written almost in these words: "Oppressed by a combination of my enemies and by the charge of false crimes, since no place is left here for truth or for my innocence, I appeal to the immortal gods that I have lived toward you, Caesar, with sincere loyalty, and toward your mother with no less reverence. For my sons I beg her protection and yours. My son Cenius had no part in my recent conduct, whatever it was, since during all that time he remained at Rome. My son Marcus advised me not to return to Syria. Would that I, old as I am, had yielded to him, rather than he, young as he is, to me. Therefore I beg all the more earnestly that, innocent as he is, he may not suffer punishment for my guilt. By a series of services over 45 years, I entreat you, by our former partnership in the consulship, by the memory of the deified Augustus your father, by his friendship for me, by mine for you, I entreat you for the life and fortune of my unhappy son. This is the last request I shall ever make of you." Piso said nothing about Plancina. After this, Tiberius cleared the young men of any crime in connection with the civil war. He said that Marcus had obeyed the orders of his father, and that a son could not refuse them. He also lamented the noble house, and even the miserable fate of Piso himself, however much Piso had deserved it. For Plancina, Tiberius pleaded with shame and guilt, claiming that his mother had pressed him to do so. Against Livia especially, the private murmurs of the best people grew bitter and sharp. They asked whether this was the tenderness of a grandmother, to receive into her sight the murderess of her grandson, to be intimate with her, and to snatch her away from the vengeance of the Senate. They said that Germanicus alone had been denied what the laws granted to every citizen. Vitellius and Veranius had mourned and pleaded the cause of that prince. The emperor and his mother had defended and protected Plancina. From now on, they said, she might continue the infernal art she had tried so successfully, repeat her poisonings, and use her arts and poisons against Agrippina and her children, until the worthy grandmother and uncle were satisfied with the blood of that most miserable house. In this mock trial, 2 days were wasted. During all that time, Tiberius encouraged the sons of Piso to defend their mother. When the advocates and witnesses had pressed the charge forcefully and no answer was made, pity prevailed over hatred. The consul Aurelius Cotta was asked first for his opinion, because when the emperor collected the votes, the magistrates also voted. Cotta's sentence was that Piso's name should be erased from the annals, that part of his estate should be forfeited and part given to his son Cenius, once Cenius changed that name, that his son Marcus should be stripped of his rank, given 50,000 great sestertia, and banished for 10 years, and that Plancina, at the request of Livia, should be granted immunity. The emperor reduced much of the sentence, especially the proposal to erase Piso's name from the annals. Marcus Piso was also spared the disgrace of degradation, and Tiberius left him all his inheritance from his father. As I have often said already, Tiberius could not be corrupted by money, and after the shame of having acquitted Plancina, he was then more lenient than usual. He also opposed Valerius Messallinus's proposal to set up a golden statue in the temple of Mars the Avenger, and Caesenus Severus's proposal to build an altar to revenge. The name of Mark Antony, who made war on his country, and the name of Julius Antonius, who by adultery violated the house of Augustus, still remain in the annals. Monuments like these are fit only for victories over foreign enemies. Domestic disasters should be buried in sorrow. Messallinus had added that public thanks should be given to Tiberius, Livia, Antonia, Agrippina, and Drusus for having avenged the death of Germanicus, but he had omitted Claudius. Lucius Asprinus, in the presence of the Senate, asked Messallinus whether he had left Claudius out on purpose. Only then was the name of Claudius added. The more I turn over events, recent or ancient, the more mockery and uncertainty I see in all human wisdom and human affairs. In public fame, in the hopes, wishes, and reverence of the people, every man seemed marked out for the empire sooner than the man for whom fortune was then secretly reserving sovereignty. A few days later, on the motion of Tiberius, the Senate advanced Vitellius, Veranius, and Servius to the honors of the priesthood. He promised Fulcinius his support and vote for promotion, but advised him not to weaken his eloquence by too much vehemence. This was the end of the vengeance. taken for the death of Germanicus, an affair reported with uncertainty not only by those who lived then and were concerned in it, but also by later generations. So dark and entangled are all the greatest transactions. Some people treat the weakest rumors as certain facts, while others turn facts into falsehoods, and both are accepted and enlarged by the credulity of posterity. Drusus now went outside the city to renew the ceremony of the auspices, and soon returned in the triumph of ovation. A few days later his mother Vipsania died. Of all the children of Agrippa, she alone died peacefully. The rest either plainly perished, or are believed to have perished by the sword, by poison, or by famine. After this, a proposal was made to moderate the law Papia Papia. Augustus had made this law in his old age to strengthen the laws of Julius Caesar, punish celibacy, and enrich the treasury. Even by this means marriages and children had not increased, while the passion for living unmarried and childless prevailed. Meanwhile, the number of people threatened and endangered by the law grew every day, as families were ruined by the interpretations and legal tricks of informers. Thus, as the city had once suffered under the weight of crimes, it now suffered under a plague of laws. This thought leads me back to the first beginning of laws, and to explain the stages and causes by which we have reached the present number and excess, a number infinite and confused. The first race of men, still free from every corrupt passion, lived without deceit and crimes, and therefore without punishments or restraints. There was no need for rewards when they naturally followed righteousness, and because they desired nothing contrary to justice, they were forbidden nothing by fear. But after they abandoned their original equality, and passed from modesty and shame at doing evil into ambition and violence, lordly dominion and arbitrary rule were introduced, and in many nations became permanent. Some peoples, either from the beginning or after they had grown tired of kings, preferred the sovereignty of laws. Since men's minds were then simple, these laws were at first short and plain. The most famous laws were those Minos made for the Cretans, those Lycurgus made for the Spartans, and later those Solon gave to the Athenians, which were now more numerous and more carefully composed. Among the Romans, Romulus administered justice according to his own pleasure. After him, Numa governed the people by religious practices and laws believed to be divine. Some institutions were made by Tullus Hostilius, and some by Ancus Martius, but above all our laws were those founded by Servius Tullius, laws that even our kings were bound to obey. After Tarquin was expelled, the people, to secure their freedom against the encroachments and factions of the Senate, and to bind public concord, prepared many ordinances. From this came the Decemviri, who composed the 12 tables from a collection of the best institutions found abroad. This was the period of all upright and impartial laws. The laws that followed, though sometimes made against crimes and offenders, were chiefly made through violence, from the hatred between the two estates, for gaining offices unjustly withheld, for keeping offices unjustly held, for banishing famous patriots, and for other wicked purposes. Hence came the Gracchi and Saturnini, who inflamed the people. Hence came Drusus, who, on behalf of the Senate, competed with those agitators in concessions to the populace. And hence came the corrupt promises made to our Italian allies, promises made deceitfully or defeated by the intervention of some tribune. Neither during the War of Italy nor during the Civil War did the making of regulations stop. Even then many were made, and they contradicted one another. At last Sylla the dictator changed or abolished earlier laws, added many of his own, and obtained some pause in this business, but not for long. Soon afterward came the turbulent demands and proposals of Lepidus, and not long after that the tribunes were restored to their reckless power of throwing the people into turmoil whenever they pleased. Now laws were made not only for the public, but particular laws for particular men, and as corruption abounded in the Commonwealth abounded in laws. Pompey, then in his third consulship, was chosen to reform public abuses. His cures proved more harmful to the state than the diseases he was meant to heal. He made laws that served his ambition, broke them whenever they crossed his will, and lost by force the rules he had gained by force. From then on, for 20 years, civil discord raged. There was no law and no settled order. The worst men escaped punishment because their crimes were so extreme, while many good men were destroyed by their very honesty. At last Augustus Caesar, in his 6th consulship, when his power was secure, and no rival remained, abolished the arrangements he had made during the triumvirate and gave Rome laws suited to peace and to rule by one man. These laws carried penalties harsher than any known before. To enforce them, informers were appointed. Under the law Papia Papia, they were encouraged with rewards to watch those who failed to claim the privileges attached to marriage and fatherhood. Such people could not receive legacies or inheritances. What they lost was treated as vacant property and passed to the Roman people, regarded as the common parent. But the informers went far beyond this. Through them, the whole city, all Italy, and Roman citizens in every part of the empire were harassed and pursued. Many were stripped of their entire fortunes, and fear had seized everyone. To restrain the abuse, Tiberius chose 20 noblemen to review the law, 5 former consuls, 5 former praetors, and 10 other senators. They explained many of its complications, softened its severity, and gave some immediate relief. Around this time, Tiberius recommended Nero, one of the sons of Germanicus, to the Senate. Nero was now 17 years old. Tiberius asked that he be excused from holding the office of the vigintivirate, and that he be allowed to seek the quaestorship 5 years earlier than the laws allowed. Everyone who heard this understood that the request was a piece of empty formality. Tiberius pretended that the same favors had been granted to himself and to his brother Drusus at the request of Augustus. I do not doubt that even then some people secretly mocked such petitions from Augustus. Still, that policy was natural in Augustus, while he was still laying the foundations of imperial power, and while the Republic and its recent laws were still fresh in men's minds. Besides, the connection between Augustus and his wife's sons was weaker than that between a grandfather and his grandsons. Along with the grant concerning the quaestorship, Nero received a seat in the College of Pontiffs. On the first day he entered the forum wearing the manly robe. Corn and money were distributed to the people, who rejoiced to see a son of Germanicus come of age. Their joy soon grew when he married Julia, the daughter of Drusus. But as these events brought public applause, the planned marriage of the daughter of Sejanus to the son of Claudius was met with public anger. By that alliance the nobility of the Claudian house seemed stained, and Sejanus, already suspected of ambitious designs, was raised still higher. At the end of this year Lucius Volusius and Sallustius Crispus died, both great and distinguished men. The family of Volusius was ancient, but in public office it had never risen above the praetorship until he brought it the honor of the consulship. He was also made censor for arranging the classes of the equestrian order, and he was the first to gather the wealth that later gave his family such enormous greatness. Crispus was born into an equestrian family. He was the great-nephew, through a sister, of Caius Sallustius, the famous Roman historian, and was adopted by him. The road to the highest offices stood open to him, but following the example of Maecenas, he lived without the rank of senator while surpassing in power many men who held consulships and triumphs. His way of life, his clothing, and his refinement differed from ancient manners. In expense and abundance he came close to luxury. Yet he had a strength of mind equal to great affairs, and he was all the more ready in action, because he concealed it under an appearance of idleness and sloth. In the time of Maecenas he was therefore next in favor. Later he became the chief confidant in all the secret councils of Augustus and Tiberius, and he knew of and approved the order to kill Agrippa posthumus. In old age he kept with the prince more the appearance than the substance of authority. The same had happened to Maecenas. Such is the fate of power, which is rarely lasting, perhaps because both sides grow weary. Princes have nothing more to give, and ministers have nothing more to ask. Next came the consulship of Tiberius and Drusus, the fourth for Tiberius and the second for Drusus. This consulship was notable because father and son held office together. There had indeed been a similar partnership between Tiberius and Germanicus 2 years earlier, but there the uncle was troubled by jealousy, and the blood relationship was not so close. At the beginning of the year, Tiberius withdrew to Campania on the pretext of his health. He may already have been planning a long and permanent retirement, or he may have wanted Drusus, during his father's absence, to have the honor of carrying out the consulship alone. Then an incident occurred which was small in itself, but because it produced a great dispute, it gave the young consul a chance to win public favor. Domitius Corbulo, formerly praetor, complained to the Senate that Lucius Sylla, a young nobleman, had refused to yield his place to him at a gladiatorial show. Age, family custom, and the older men supported Corbulo. On the other side, Mamercus Scaurus, Lucius Arruntius, and others worked for their kinsman Sylla. Heated speeches were made, and examples from the ancestors were brought forward, showing how they had censured and restrained the disrespect of the young by severe decrees. Drusus intervened with arguments suited to calming the quarrel. Corbulo received satisfaction from Scaurus, who was both father-in-law and uncle to Sylla, and the most fluent orator of that age. The same Corbulo then protested about the condition of most of the roads through Italy, saying that they had become broken and impassable through the fraud of contractors and the negligence of overseers. He voluntarily undertook to correct this abuse. He carried out the task less to the benefit of the public than to the ruin of many private men, damaging their fortunes and reputations through harsh fines, unjust judgments, and forfeitures.
And there we will pause. Piso is dead, the books are closed on Germanicus, and Tacitus has reminded us, in his history of the laws, that the more corrupt the state, the more numerous its statutes. Next time, in Part 2, we leave the great tragedy behind for the ordinary business of empire and discover that the ordinary business of empire is revolt, war, and fear arising in Gaul, a long guerrilla war in the African desert, and the quiet spread of the informers at home. Mind the footnotes, and beware the folly.